evidence is clear that you've been scheming. You'd like to steal away and while away the day. You'd like to spend an hour dreaming. What will it take to whip you into line? A broken heart, a broken head. It can be your end, it can be your end. Step softly, Mr. Blue. We know what's best for you, and we know where your precious dreams will take you. You've got a slot to fill, and fill that slot you will. You'll learn to love it, or we'll break you. What will it take to whip you into line? A broken heart, a broken head. It can be your end. It can be your end. Be careful, Mr. Blue. This stage you're going through can lead you nowhere else but to disaster. Excuse us while we grin. You've worn our patience thin. It's time we showed you who's your master. Don't worry, Mr. Blue. We'll take good care of you. Just think of it as sense and not surrender. But never think again that you can think again, or you'll get something you'll remember. What will it take to whip you into line? A broken heart, a broken head. It can be arranged. It can be arranged.
And I just remember back to all the bodies of the dead and wounded being raced back into the square, and the machine gun fire and the cries and moans of people as they were wounded. And I think back to one scene in particular where about 30 soldiers dragged a demonstrator out of a bus, and I watched as they had clubbed him to death.
Good evening, this is Dead Air Live. My name's Olivia. Tonight in the studio we have two gentlemen with us with a deep interest in China. They're American, and at the moment they're together working on the translation of Mao Zedong's post-1949 writings. It's already taken them 6 years to do. It'll be in 10 volumes when it's complete. As you remember, on the 27th of June, we did a show on Tienanmen Square, and tonight will be, it's 100 days or so after that event. And as I've been told with Chinese funerals, 100 days after a death, there's a ritual of again looking at the event. We have Rich Levy with us tonight, and Bob Lee. Rich has been to China 6 times, I believe, and speaks 2 Chinese languages. What are those?
Cantonese and Mandarin.
Okay. And Bob's been to China twice recently. Right. As an introduction, I wonder how you'd like to introduce yourselves or the show.
Basically, I teach Asian American Studies at Brown University, and being of Chinese descent, I've had a long interest in China. Actually, I started my academic career as a China scholar. But one of the things that I would like to establish is I don't see myself as a China expert. I don't do that professionally anymore. And one of my concerns is that Americans have relied very heavily on experts, on China experts and Asia experts to interpret China for them. And I think that it's time that we begin to, as individuals, ask our own questions about China. And what I see coming out of this program is a way not for us to provide answers, but to begin to help people develop some questions that they might ask when they read the papers or hear about events in China.
Thanks.
I share Bob's perspective very strongly. I got involved in China stuff back around '68 during the Vietnam War, trying to understand what it was that the U.S. was fighting in Vietnam and trying to understand about socialism. After that, I taught English to Chinese immigrants in Chinatown for 12 years. And I developed a whole set of contacts and friends so that when I went to China, I always went having been introduced by people, my students, to their relatives and their friends so that they were able to and willing to speak pretty frankly to me. And what I find really important is being able to let people know what people in China were talking about, like Bob says, rather than giving the definitive answer, and recognizing there is no definitive answer. There's a very complex reality over there with contradictory aspects all over it.
Could you give us an overview of since 1958 and the Great Leap Forward, and talk a bit about what that meant as well, until the emergence of the Chinese elite? Perhaps just a brief history.
Well, the reason that that's important is because a lot of times this movement is portrayed as just having started from nowhere, just instantly. And it's got a really, really long history. The recent version of it is that after the liberation of China in '49, there was a gradual process of collectivization going on. In 1958, what was called the Great Leap Forward started. What the Great Leap was an effort to literally leap forward to communism in a very short period of time. It meant the collectivization of agriculture very rapidly into communes. It meant bringing in large amounts of industry into state ownership, those portions that were not already in state ownership. It meant doing most things as a group function, and really, to a large extent, submerging a lot of individual initiatives. What happened was, as a combination of serious policy errors combined with 3 of the worst droughts in a century in successive years, and at the same time the withdrawal of Soviet experts and all Soviet aid, the Chinese economy went into a really severe depression with dire circumstances and results. In the next 5 or 6 years, a set of policies associated with Deng Xiaoping and Liu Xiaoqi came to the fore, and these policies much more were focused on loosening the collective, giving more range to private initiative, to individual initiative, to private markets, allowing for more polarization. And while those policies did bring back a certain element of economic stability and growth, they also engendered in a lot of the first generation of revolutionary leadership a fear that the revolution was being lost. It was this fear that started the criticisms of these policies, of the elitism and of the creeping capitalism, that began the Cultural Revolution.
One of the things I think that's critical to remember about the Cultural Revolution is this, one of the central issues that Mao certainly was concerned with, was with this question of revolutionary successors and who was going to succeed to the leadership. Not just individuals, but it was kind of a generational issue. How do you reproduce the revolutionary spirit? And certainly that was a central aspect of the Cultural Revolution. And one of the reasons, it seems to me, that students were seen as such an important force in Mao's mobilization of the Red Guards and so forth against the party, which he saw as being stagnant and bureaucratized and corrupt, and traveling along this capitalist path, as he said. So a real important part was this notion that students and intellectuals played this really very critical role in keeping alive the revolution. And in some ways we see the relationship, rather an often difficult, historically difficult relationship between China's intellectuals and its students vis-a-vis the party and the power holders. We see that kind of recapitulated.
Well, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, the criticisms that the Mao group was making of the party, the elitism, the bureaucratism, the increasing polarization, really struck a note so that there was a real following for the Cultural Revolution. But as it developed, and the Cultural Revolution, while being very accurate in its criticisms, wasn't able to come up with a functioning alternative that had economic and psychological rewards for its followers, the people became alienated from that model. The more alienated they become, the more the government had to rely on authoritarian methods, so that this gap grew. By the time Mao died and the Gang of Four was overthrown, it was because they had pretty much lost their support. And a new group was there, somewhat disillusioned with a new leadership came in, given a blank check, and they had this enthusiasm to try something new. The first couple of years were very successful, and their support grew. But as the problems of the reforms came out, the inflation, the unemployment, this started to dissipate their base. And increasingly, they've started to lose their base. And it's in that sort of process, combined with the disillusionment of the Cultural Revolution, now the disillusionment of this new set of policies, that these demonstrations grew out of this history of several successive disillusions, and that things were not going in a direction that people had hoped they would. So it wasn't a new phenomena. It was gradually creeping up and repeating types of criticisms coming together at a particular conjuncture.
One of the things that I think was interesting was that when I was in China in '82, as the reforms were just kind of picking up steam and so forth and getting underway, there's a great deal of enthusiasm for them and so forth, a great sense of hope. And when I was there last year, even though, for example, in Nanjing there was this huge building boom, one could look out of the window and see, these skyscrapers going up all over, there was a certain sense of real kind of disillusionment, a certain sense of frustration, of the difficulty of getting things done, of the corruption and so forth. And I think one had the sense then, certainly, that despite on the surface, or in physical sense, a lot of building and construction going on, there was a more deep-seated dissatisfaction with the pace of change and the sense of direction, really, I think.
We have a tape now, which is part of our last show on China, which is looking at the power struggle that was going on from these students' point of view. Can we go to the tape now?
Why did the Chinese government come down so swiftly and so violently on such a peaceful demonstration?
I don't think they came down so swiftly after all, but I knew that they were going to come down on the students as early as April. I told many students of mine at the University of Maine. I told many policymakers in Washington, D.C., who I meet with them on a monthly basis, that the repression were going to come. And they said, no. They said Li Peng was going to be kicked out, Deng Xiaoping was going to get kicked out. He said, no. Deng Xiaoping has been a very ruthless person. He has carried out repression before many times. He killed many people the first time in 1957. After that, many other times, he was going to carry out this repression. But, they waited. They waited for the right opportunity to do it.
Why didn't people warn the students? Why didn't other people who were giving advice to the students or leading them make them aware of what had been going on in Chinese history?
This is something that, we don't know yet, but I think the students were used, if not to say they were caught in a gigantic power struggle. China is a gigantic country. The Chinese party itself has 47 million people, you see. So this is a case of protecting the party against a handful of students. And you could see that they were going to move against the students. And in that case, it was not very different from repression elsewhere. Repression in, for example, South Korea. And Deng Xiaoping, by the way, many times said that South Korea was his model. It's a model where you can carry out economic reform without political reform. And the United States egged on South Korea. For years, South Korea were able to carry out repression, and the United States said nothing.
Well, the United States is being forced to say something now, or possibly being forced to say something. How did, as I asked Ed Cheng earlier, how could Deng Xiaoping think that he could separate political reform and economic reform? It sounds like he was willing to make economic reforms, wanted to, but was not willing to make any political reforms.
Well,
How could he do that and not know that he would lose the support of Western countries?
that was what I was just telling you. I mean, he saw the case of Korea, and he said, hey, look, Korea has been doing this, you know, for a long time, has been repressing students. United States nothing about it. You know, people still trade with Korea. Look at us, China. This is a gigantic country. This is a big country. We have about $20 billion worth of trade with foreign countries every year. You know, those foreign countries need us more than even they need South Korea. So therefore, we can go out and do this kind of thing. But there's an added element to this, and that was this. From 1978 to 1979, up to about 2 years ago, the reform went too fast, really fast. The economy was overheated. About 100 million people were moved, you know, from the countryside, from the hinterland, to the urban areas, to the coastal area. This created tremendous problems, social problems, political problems, unemployment, plus the fact that because of the economic reform, the provinces are now getting very powerful, especially the rich provinces along the coastal area, and the central government lost its power vis-a-vis the provinces. So, you know, about 3 years ago, the government tried to retrench.
Lost their power because of the economics that was happening with the economic advantage that the southern provinces
could,
had.
yes, also corruption. Corruption has a way of eating away the power of the party.
Who are the groups vying for power now?
Well, I think what's happened in the past 10 years is that the new policies of the Communist Party, the so-called reforms, have created and strengthened certain elites that directly challenge the power both of the party and sort of the dominance of the peasantry and the working class in society. The policies have created a new entrepreneurial commercial class, which now increasingly has economic and political power to back up its desires for unrestricted commercial freedom, the right to hire and fire, to change wages without restrictions. The party has pulled out of production consciously, leaving production more in the hands of a technocratic elite, which sees party rule now as increasingly interference in their economic issues. The students have virtually a monopoly on future knowledge, and also see that as a question, why they should continue following the party. On the other hand, the workers tend to be much more interested in economic issues, inflation and equity. I was walking home from a demonstration with a Shanghai dock worker and asked him if he supported the demonstrations. He said, who wouldn't? You know, but what I'm really interested in is economic equity. I mean, I make 200 yuan a month after 19 years on the docks. These people running these restaurants are making 600 yuan a month. There's an inequity here. We don't like that.
One of the things that that seemed to be quite apparent is in our analysis of who's vying for power. I mean, the American press has tended to focus on, the biographies of the Chinese Communist Party. But I think what you're saying is the question of new elites and different reshufflings of economic power that are happening in China needs to be taken into account. One of the things that is rarely taken into account is the peasantry, at least in this discussion of the democracy movement and so forth. And the growth of a new rich peasantry owns its own land, and now can sell and buy and sell land in certain cases, and in fact buy and sell labor, which is another issue. That's going to, I think, have a tremendous impact on the long-range future of how these power struggles, as it were, get sorted out.
And that the power struggles are in some ways very contradictory. Right now, everybody was united in opposition to the arbitrary authority and the corruption of the party. But should this alliance succeed, there are very serious contradictions within it that would have them struggling directly against each other.
What are those
Well, the
contradictions?
businessman I talked to said, you know, of course I'm afraid of democracy. Democracy means that I can expand my business, that I can hire and fire workers without people bothering me, that I can buy my supplies on the open market and sell at any price I want. The workers I talked to wanted exactly the opposite. They wanted some stability in their income, some stability in their work. They wanted a maintenance of some restrictions on this entrepreneur. A really interesting thing, somebody who was supposedly translating for Ted Koppel in Beijing was asking residents of Beijing what democracy meant to them. And they said an end to inflation. That's a very different version. The elderly people I talked to said, I fought 50 years. I was at a friend's house for dinner. I fought 50 years for a communist society, a society where an individual can flourish, but within a society that people help each other. I'm totally apolitical. I'm totally disappointed. This selfishness, this greed, the prostitution, the child labor, that's what I fought to overcome, and this has all come back with the reforms.
One of the people that I met on the street in Nanjing, just a young man, and we were talking, and he said, you know, that the main problem with China, and this occurred time after time actually, was that you can't do business here. It's hard to do business. Government's always, you know, on our backs. There's always this bureaucracy and so forth. And he was going off to join an uncle in Madrid to open a restaurant or something. But clearly, I mean, on that level, there was a sense that how they define freedom, if you will, was more ability for enterprise, individual enterprise. At the same time, this question about inflation, I mean, for many intellectuals, people in university and so forth, they were the hardest hit often by inflation in China and so forth. They have a very fixed income and so forth, and at the same time have a certain kind of status in society and certain kind of expectations about their status in society that makes dealing with that inflation incredibly hard. Yeah. When the Shanghai Hilton opened, for example, there were thousands of people who flocked to the Shanghai Hilton for jobs, including many university professors and so forth who, because they could speak English, would try to get a job there. And one wonders kind of about the kind of intellectual dislocation or the
psychological cost
of
those individuals are doing.
You know, giving up your lifetime of scholarly work, because you want to become a waiter or a busboy.
Why are they giving it? Because they're
they
not
can make much more money. Right.
Do they need the money? I mean, are they finding they need the money?
There are a couple of pictures, for example, that I had taken over the years, just in terms of what these changes are. And during the Cultural Revolution, there was a social ethic and of people supporting one another. And to some extent, there was forced conformity to that, but there was also a very deep belief by a lot of people that made sense. I went to China in 80 or 82 it was, and I saw this sign all over the city, all over the countryside, saying time is money, efficiency is life. Just sort of the absolute reversal. In 1980, I went to Canton and I spent an hour and a half trying to find a restaurant anywhere in the city. In 1984, I took a picture of a restaurant, just totally covered in Pepsi-Cola, cartons, and the contrast in people's minds of what's going on there. I looked at inflation. I just went to the market 3 months ago in Shanghai, and there were prices of crabs. It's a luxury item, but it was 110 yuan for half a kilogram. 110 yuan is about 2 weeks' salary for a university professor. 5 years ago, that was 5 yuan. The inflation is really hurting people, and it's the difference between the students and the workers. Right. The workers really care about the inflation. The students haven't quite gotten there.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me in my last trip to China this past year was the amount of quite high-end American luxury items. I noticed, for example, a very fancy salon brand of shampoo. This is not in a friendship store. This is a regular, Chinese department store. And one had to wonder who is buying that? I mean, it costs here like, you know, $10 a bottle or something. And so it suggests to me, too, that that there is a group of people who are making money. There's a market for that. Certainly, the average urban income can't afford that, and that suggests then there is a fair
There's
amount
a
of
polarization
corruption
going on also. And the polarization, there was just a startling case. I was in China in 1980, and a friend who was a construction worker took me to a soccer game. Two young doctors were sitting behind us and explaining the irrationalities of China's socialist medical system, because they, as skilled doctors, were getting paid the same as any cruddy old worker on the street. And when we left the game, I asked my friend, who was one of those cruddy old workers, what he thought about that. And he said, they get 70 yuan a month after graduating. I get 30 after 30 years of being a construction worker. Now, I know I'm just a stupid old worker, but I know that 70 ain't equal to 30, right? And I know that must be working hard, but I've been doing construction for 30 years, and I don't like their elitism. These were the type of people who are being groomed to be the leadership. My friend is the type of person who's being groomed to be at the bottom. These are changes that are happening incredibly rapidly. A society that always valued social help and collectiveness. When I was in China, there was a story about a soldier who had, saved some people from being ripped off and was seriously injured. He was taken to the hospital and turned away for medical emergency because he didn't have cash. By the time the police had raised enough money, he was dead.
Sure.
And medical students who I spoke to defended that, saying, well, you have to have money. I mean, if you start giving away free medical care, where are you going to be? The medical system in the past 10 years in the countryside has been gutted. The agricultural irrigation system is falling apart because it's a collective system. Nobody is individually responsible for it. The grasslands are being overgrazed. The forests are being cut, so that any sense of collectivity is being gutted with this thing of get rich now, get rich first, take care of yourself. People were complaining to me all throughout Shanghai. Years ago, we had a sense of peace at home. Now everything is greedy. Now there's more fights at home. There's more fights on the street. The buses are falling apart. People are stealing everything that you can possibly find. Why should I be collective? It's a sucker's role now.
About Shanghai is if one visits there, one can now get a sense of what Shanghai before the war might have been like. I mean, there's been a growth of kind of an underclass in Shanghai that's quite remarkable. I mean, for example, there's a large Uyghur population. Peoples from the autonomous regions in the West have moved into the cities, and now in some ways form kind of a demi-monde, if you will. They're very involved in the black market and prostitution and so forth. And but it's quite out in the open, which is also kind of the other surprising thing. There seems to be little control over that. I mean, one always read about kind of periodic editorials in the People's Daily, criticizing prostitution and corruption and so forth. But it's clear that it was last year that it was really very much out in the open.
And what you see that's really confusing, both workers I talked to and in students who are very active in this movement, was that they would list virtually every aspect of the reforms that they didn't like: the inflation, the unemployment, the alienation, the decline of public services, the the false marketing, and then they would say, but I'm in favor of the reforms, as if they could get these reforms in some super ideal sense without all of the necessary things that come with them. They want the cat but no tail, or maybe they want the tail with no cat. It's unclear, but they don't want the whole animal.
What do you mean by all the necessary things that will come with
Well,
them?
with the reforms, with this change of eliminating production in order to serve people's needs and making it much more production for profit, you raise prices. You have to, because Chinese housing has always been incredibly subsidized at 5% of people's incomes. Food has always been subsidized. Clothing has always been subsidized. Now these things are coming to market prices. That's going to cause incredible inflation. People had guaranteed jobs, even if they weren't always the most productive. That's being eliminated. A man I met 8 years ago had his old age pension taken away because it was given by a factory, and they decided it wasn't profitable. All of the things that come out of moving to this privatistic, profit-oriented economy, people sort of want to believe that they can be the one to make 10,000 yuan. They can be the one to have the TV. They can be the one to have the shampoo. But all of the negative effects that come with the market economy aren't going to be there for them.
Another aspect of that is kind of the development of a culture of consumerism. And it seemed to me that that has a very kind of dislocating effect. I mean, there's a sense in China, it seemed to me, that anything Western was fine, anything Chinese was bad. I mean, it kind of got back to the old kind of colonialist mentality of kind of China's inferiority complex. And one could see, for example, one of the big building booms there in Shanghai last year was bars. I mean, you saw all of these little kind of, one bar was in fact called the Red Girl Bar, and I just, really
And you
shocking.
were talking about just sort of the self-deprecation of the encourage of operations to change people's
I mean,
eyes
even
so
in the
that they look
official
Western.
press,
Wow.
there
Which
are
is-
articles about, in favor of Chinese women kind of having their eyes made more Western and so forth.
So there's this incredible burst of dissent and dissatisfaction and self-deprecation that people are reacting to. And the reforms economically seem to have peaked also. They're not having the economic payoff that they did 5 years ago.
Well,
And
that's-
also, you're not just talking about corruption on a government level, you're just talking about it seeping into...
That's right. I think seeping
the
into
bottom.
everyday life in ways that are not even perhaps conscious. I mean, I don't think that, but are just kind of part of the landscape. Part
Yeah,
of
one really startling thing. Everybody I talked to complained about corruption. At one point, some friends and I went to rent, a boat, and the crew, it was a state-run boat company, said, "No, we're almost off duty, but if you pay us in cash and don't ask for a receipt so that we can pocket it, we'll rent you the boat. If you want a receipt, which means the money goes to the state, we won't do it." But they were very anti-corruption. It's like, who wants to be pure in a situation where you have to increasingly be corrupt to exist? And the corruption, what I'm saying is the corruption is not a matter of bad individuals. It's part of a transformation of a social structure. You have a whole set of laws set up to encourage production that meets people's needs in a positive way. Now you start producing for profit. The laws don't match. What do? You start bribing the cops. You start bribing the inspectors. You start bribing everybody to get around the laws so you can do what you want to do. And all of a sudden you have the money to make those bribes. 5 years down the road, you say, why am I paying all these bribes? Why don't I just become the city councilor? Why don't I just change the laws? And that's where you start getting into political conflict on a large level when you have a new class that has the political power to challenge the present class. That's why at a large level, although there is no reason for the demonstration in Tienanmen to lead to violence, there's such a massive change in which elite and which groups are dominating society that there was going to be violence. If it didn't happen at Tienanmen, it would have happened 3 months, 3 years, 4 years later. But it's going to happen.
When you talk about all this, what sort of feeling do you have looking at the changes that have taken place and the frustrations over the years with your love and your interest in China?
I guess my own kind of personal reaction is one of great sadness. I mean, you see sadness both kind of for the ongoing kind of corruption of Chinese society and culture and stuff. And I don't mean to say that in a sense of kind of valorizing kind of traditional Chinese culture or even kind of a revolutionary zeal of the Maoist period, but one which I think is a real genuine sense of dislocation, of not knowing, not feeling good about being Chinese. And I get the sense that there is a deep sense of that, as well as kind of a sadness of how this last episode, as it were, has ended, with bloodshed and
ended in era.
But I think there's a longer kind of term issue. For example, Chinese women, I think, in this era of reform have been put a step back, if you will. And one, I remember going to the Hilton Hotel and watching waitresses in these long traditional Chinese qipao, standing there in silence, waiting to be, they're the waitresses in there. And one got the sense of a real contrast between one's image and self-image of Chinese women in an earlier period where they were much more kind of vocal. I mean, this is a way of really silencing women in China.
Yeah, in '78 I walked into a restaurant where they later told me I was the only non-Chinese who had ever been seen. It's a pretty not touristy place. And about 5 or 7 in the morning, all the customers walked out who I'd been talking to. I was about to get up and leave, and this waitress came over and said, "Sit down, you can't leave now." I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Here you are, these guys get to talk to you. We've never seen a white person in here. Now they leave, the staff has a chance to talk to you, and you're going to leave and I'm not going to get to talk to you? You out of your mind?" And she went into an explanation of why, even though China was poor, she felt very much prouder to be part of a socialist society. She had guaranteed income, she had guaranteed house, she had guaranteed job, she had guaranteed medicine. She wasn't on her own, she always was part of a group. 6 years later, she was not that. She was apolitical. She was trying to make a buck.
Why?
The whole change in the social ethic, I'm not sure exactly why, but she was she was a much quieter person with much less expectation.
Well, I think the question why gets back to the kind of political question too, because the possibilities of dissent and so forth. I mean, there are political institutions that aren't there to kind of channel kind of that kind of individual dissent or resistance. I mean, resistance is quite difficult in China, even on a personal basis as well on a mass basis. So I think it's not easy for your waitress friend or a woman who now is tends bar in the Hilton Hotel to kind of stake that claim for herself.
But did she change because the support stopped, the support that she was feeling?
I think she changed because the society was in change, and it's very hard, as Bob says, to resist that on an individual basis. The possibilities for her were different. Her self-image was different. Her image of what is an appropriate role for a woman was changing. People were being actively told to be less interested in politics, to take an interest in making a buck right now and spending it on consumer goods, and that's what they should be interested in. And it's very hard when a very strong apparatus is working in that direction.
And the goods are there too.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's not
it
just
is not a
propaganda.
matter of just propaganda. It is, the goods
The reality
are
was
out
changing.
there and dangled in front of you. It's a very difficult thing to resist.
So I'm just wondering we only have a few minutes left before looking at the next tape, but I just wonder what your sense is of what can come out of this.
Out of the student movement?
Out of the sense of disillusionment and all the people feeling different senses of what they want. And
My own feeling, is that it's very difficult to kind of predict, and I wouldn't want to try to kind of predict an outcome of this. I mean, what we're seeing, it seems to me, is this great kind of unleashing, if you will, of new social forces. And it will take some time. We don't, for example, with the student movement or the democracy movement, there's a whole variety of political tendencies, that are there.
Yeah,
There's a nationalism
And they ranged also in people I talked to, from people who wanted just to reform the party and make it honest and for the people again, to those who felt we couldn't resist the party because it was too strong, to those who openly called for the overthrow of the party and the institution of capitalism.
Right.
And they were all united right now.
Right. So it will be some time before we see how that movement is coming. We haven't yet heard from the peasants, who make up still the great majority of Chinese people. There are a lot of forces out there that over the next decade or so are going to to make their weight felt.
And in our next tape, we're going to look at an insert from our last show about the media, the effects of the media, the role the media has in what's going on, what's been going on in China.
I don't think people are so isolated from the rest of the world, especially in large cities like Shanghai or even Hangzhou, as she mentioned. VOA has been accessible to many
VOA is the
people
Voice
in
of
the city,
America.
the Voice of America, and BBC. And of course, there has been some interference from the official broadcast, but interference is a very expensive thing, and they cannot do that 24 hours a day. And I also know that the Voice of America has been having this program 11 hours long, which is in Chinese. But for example, in my family, my brothers and sisters, they all have English, so they don't have to listen to the Chinese program, which is even longer. And so many people in the city actually know what has been going on.
Is Voice of America or the BBC usually have broadcasts in Chinese?
Yes.
Is that Cantonese?
And shorter, yeah. In cities like Canton, in Guangzhou, well, you don't have to listen to VOA or BBC. You can listen to those radios from Hong Kong, and it's even more accessible then.
Even TV, not only radios.
So both of you are from places where there's relatively quite a bit of access to media, being in the South.
Yeah.
For instance, if you were in more central China or in Beijing.
Yeah,
Is that
I
true?
spent 6 years in an inland province, which was about 800 miles from Shanghai, which is on the border of Jiangxi and Hunan province. And I was there during the later years of the Cultural Revolution. And I remember even then, I listened to VOA every night. And many of my friends there who were born and brought up in those provinces, they also listened to the VOA. Like when the Chairman Mao's wife, the so-called Gang of Four, when they toppled down, my friends and I, we immediately knew much earlier than the official media because we got it from the VOA. And so,
Are there routes of communication, underground or grapevine kind of communication between in China? So, for instance, the people who do listen to VOA or BBC, are there ways that they can get that information to more central China where people can't get those broadcasts that you're aware of?
Yeah, most Chinese people, I think there's about 65% Chinese people live in the East Coast. So, and most big cities are there. But to the information I got is that in central China, like in Xi'an, people know very little about what happened in Beijing, and that's why 2 student leaders were arrested in Xi'an.
Well, to return to the media, which you say was irresponsible in their treatment of the students, they've also perhaps are a factor in forcing the U.S. government to treat them differently. Do you agree with that?
Yes, but you see, I didn't say that they were irresponsible, but you see the way they treat the whole thing. It was just like a carnival. It's like as if, if you just appear on TV for 1 more week, then Deng Xiaoping would be gone, and that kind of thing. And students, were not that experienced in political struggle. They didn't know the balance of power in the world and that kind of thing. So they thought, hey, let's lengthen this thing for a little bit more. But to be sure, you see, by having the visibility, the world knows what's happening in China. And hopefully, we can carry the fire on. But at the same time, this kind of repression, is going to put the student movement back, 2 years, 3 years, maybe for a longer period.
This is Dead Air Live. My name's Olivia, and we're in the studio talking about China. What do you feel the role of the media is?
Well, I was in China for 2 weeks before and a week after the massacre in Tienanmen, and the role of the media was really, from inside of China, incredible. On the one hand, from about the 13th to the 20th, there was pretty much unrestricted access to the press. People were writing differently than they had been able to write before, and one Chinese news person I had spoken to said, if nothing else happens from this set of events, China will have experienced a week of honest reporting and real reporting that they'll never forget, but there's going to be a real heavy price to pay for that. Very predictive person. I remember sitting and watching the announcement of martial law. You know, it was read slowly 3 times with characters on so that if you didn't understand the dialect or anything, you would see it. It was very, very clear that something very heavy was happening. But perhaps the most amazing thing that I saw was 2 nights after the massacre, watching a TV news program in Beijing where they had a 20-minute clip of students and people in Beijing casually burning army trucks and tanks with no interference by the army, and dragging soldiers out and beating them. And whether that was provocateurs, which I assume played a role, whether people were so angry that they were doing that, the message of the tape was, look, Chinese people, what these rabble are doing. If this movement takes over, this is what you're going to face. And with the history of the Cultural Revolution, that was very powerful. For me, someone who's been exposed to Western media for my whole life and who has my own understanding of news manipulation and knows that I have access to alternate media, that was just riveting. It was just incredible how powerful that scene was. It made me doubt everything that I'd heard for 2.5 weeks. If you then imagine seeing only that repeated for 3 weeks, there's a real major role for the Chinese media.
I think the Western media also played a really quite important role. And I think its role was really mixed. I mean, certainly the students, and I think this is true of kind of most movements that are relatively powerless, or facing much greater political power, tend to see the press as their friend, and they tend to want to use it. And I think it was very clear, because of Gorbachev's visit and the presence there of thousands of Western cameras and news reporters, the student movement had access to the press. And this was really unprecedented in Chinese history. And I think it took both the students and the government by surprise. I don't think either of them had the skills to manipulate the press. I think the students in some ways were better at it because the press was basically more sympathetic to their position. But I think eventually the press kind of pushed events along in ways that the students were not necessarily aware of. For example, I think it tended to privilege those students who were most conversant with American or Western political symbols. So when they would be questioned about what you mean by democracy, it was all the students who could kind of quote Madison or Jefferson who would get, who would get the airtime. At the same time, they began to shape the questions. If we moved, if the student movement was one that began with the question of corruption, it quickly moved to the question of democracy, as however, in the struggle to define what that meant for the Western press, in some ways may have distracted or shifted the discourse towards this other question that was really, in some ways, the West's agenda, and may not have been originally as central to the Chinese agenda.
That sort of shows up when you read the wall posters like we have behind us. These are pictures of some of the wall posters that I took in Shanghai. They don't have that same view. There isn't the same focus on democracy in that same sense. It's like there's an internal dialogue and there's a dialogue for the Western press.
What do these posters say?
These are talking about the need, a lot of anti-corruption, a lot of stuff about the arbitrary authority of the party, incorrect policies of the party, a lot of very tactical posters helping students analyze who are the factions in the leadership, who can we rely on. A lot of posters saying, we as students alone can't do this. We have to be in touch with workers. We have to have a base outside. Alone we're isolated and we're dead. Which is oddly enough a shared perspective with Deng Xiaoping, who said as long as the students are demonstrating, we're okay. When they start reaching the workers, we're in trouble. And I think that's part of what set off the killing. An interesting thing that several people have pointed out is that after the massacre, virtually all the people publicly executed were workers. the message was, workers, don't mess around.
Right.
We're not playing. We'll shoot students, but we're shooting you too.
Right. I think one of the clear things, I mean, particularly the executions of workers, I mean, made it clear to me that one of the great fears was another kind of solidarity movement, unauthorized unions and that kind of thing. But kind of to get back to the question of the Western press, so one of the other things that that struck me was how the Western press in some ways made it much more difficult for private politics to happen. The very public nature of this debate. For example, the confrontation between the student leaders Wu Kai-shi and Li Peng, in which the students brought in the cameras, okay, made it that impossible really for any kind of personal or private politics to go on. It made the issue really confrontational in terms of posturing, of public posturing. And I think that made kind of an ability to reach some sort of settlement or some sort of dialogue very difficult. And I think in some ways neither side was able to kind of then put the genie back in its box, if you will. It was there, and it was a major player by its very presence. And I'm not suggesting that there is a kind of specific agenda. I think its very presence was problematic for both sides.
And I think it also probably gave the students some false sense of security, that nothing would happen with all this press here. And it's true, most massacres happen away from the press. I mean, Guatemala, El Salvador, the first step in massacring people is do it in the countryside where you ain't being watched by UP and and the like. There was that false sense of security. I think when the leadership, I mean, Deng said, when it spreads to the workers, we're in trouble. We have to do this to protect the party. I think that violence in this particular case was really avoidable. Violence in the intermediate run is likely. But this could have been avoided. Deng could have said, look, you guys collect 200 students, we'll put 100 party members on, we'll have a committee to investigate corruption, and how to deal with inflation. You can outvote us at any time. If they come up with anything good, the party takes credit. If they fail, they blame it on the students. Everybody goes home, the party is happy, nobody gets killed. What happened? Something happened. There was...
I get the sense that that it was a very public nature of the confrontation that made the violent confrontation, the crackdown, almost inevitable, if not actually, because it was very difficult, and I think there was a real sense of crisis. It was very difficult to reach that kind of compromise in this very public arena, which the Chinese leadership was certainly not used to.
And having just been embarrassed in front of Gorbachev and the world press.
International humiliation. I mean, when Gorbachev has to be kind of, hustled in the rear entrance of the Great Hall of the People. I mean, they can't have the honor guard in front of in Tienanmen and so forth. And this is a tremendous humiliation for Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese leadership. And it seems to me that the kind of the personal rancor, personal humiliation that it must have meant for Deng Xiaoping certainly pushed him towards that kind of Bismarckian, if you will, response. Bismarck had been his, as a student, Bismarck was his hero.
The combination of factors now set it off. It could have, had Gorbachev not been here, it might have been peaceful.
Right, any number of possibilities.
But it probably would have happened soon thereafter.
Right. What do you think the movement has accomplished then, given this?
For me, one of the most amazing things, again, I was able to take some pictures of it, was going through Shanghai and seeing the involvement of non-students. There were wall posters all over Shanghai, not just on the college campuses, but buildings all throughout Shanghai were covered, and in a level of involvement that I've never seen in the U.S., they were constantly being read and debated, not by students, but by workers, by other people. I walked into a demonstration at night of 400,000 people, And what was amazing was that they were in clusters of 20 and 30 people, the outside people leaning in to the point that their feet weren't almost touching the ground, just to hear these debates, and these were intensely political debates. There was a level of involvement and intensity, a level of democracy beginning that I've never seen here.
One of the things that I think is really important to bear in mind is that we know very little in some ways about the democracy movement. I mean, there is this tremendous upheaval going on in China, and people are talking about these issues. It's created a whole new political language, if you will, in China. And yet it's one that I think we need to watch carefully to see. There's all sorts of tendencies within it, different models of development, whether or not China goes along the South Korean model, or whether or not it tries to reformulate its own kind of path to socialism, how it will stand on issues of nationalism. Nationalism is one of the centerpieces of the democracy movement. You know, that Chinese shouldn't kill Chinese, but well, does that mean Chinese should kill Tibetans? I mean, what does the democracy movement mean for non-Han peoples, for the Tibetans or the Uyghurs and so forth, or Taiwan or Hong Kong? The question, you know, of the riots in Nanjing also had in there, which ended up as being anti-black riots, a race riot, if you will, also had ties to this movement. It began with this argument about corruption and so forth, but it had its very dark side to it. I mean, it really showed a kind of racism amongst the Chinese. We need to see how all of these tendencies begin to be articulated and worked out and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, 2.5 years ago there was a student set of demonstrations that attracted no mass support. This time the demands were more general. They were more focused on the corruption, not only because the students picked up on it, but the corruption was more endemic. And Deng Xiaoping's son is so incredibly hated for being corrupt. Zhao Ziyang, who is sort of the darling of the Western press, and at a very late stage sort of became the last hope of the student demonstration, was also hated. His son is as corrupt as Deng Xiaoping's son. These issues just could no longer be ignored. The inflation could no longer be ignored. So you had everybody coming together, but with this intensity that this matters, this is going to affect my life. Something that isn't parallel in like an American presidential election for most people. So there was, at least in the cities, this intense involvement. 24 hours a day you'd go places and see crowds of people debating what to do next. The countryside, I assume, was real different. And how that information gets out to the countryside will be predominantly through the government media, but secondarily through the kids who were in the colleges and in the towns going back and telling their friends and relatives.
One of the other issues is how the now quite large Chinese student population in the West, in the United States in particular, is going to organize itself, what kind of factions and ideological tendencies emerge there, because they have been quite successful in kind of capturing the attention, at least temporarily, of the American people, as well as the Chinese communities in the United States, been very successful in raising funds and so forth. So they'll be a factor, but what kind of factor really remains to be seen.
I'd like to thank you both very much. I'm sorry we've actually run out of time because I know there was more to discuss. But thank you very much.
I'm glad to be here.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Blue. We've got our eyes on you. The evidence is clear. You've been scheming. You'd like to steal away and while away the day. You'd like to spend an hour dreaming.